morning. It is Monday morning. This is Small Business Connections with Ann Brennan, ASMM Digital Marketing. We're the podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. And our goal each and every week is to give you something you can walk away with and put to work in your business. This week, we're going to talk about succession planning, and I think it's such an important topic for a lot of reasons, but one of the ones that is really right now with the pandemic, with everything that's going on, what happens to your business if something happens to you? We say this a lot in our business, that what happens to your website if you get hit by a bus, right? That's the thing. Or I do a lot of hiking. I'm like, what happens to my company if I get eaten by a bear, right? So we're going to talk about succession planning, and that's our topic today. We're going to talk to Sam Brownell about that. But before we start, let's go on with some of the housekeeping measures, and one of those is subscribing. I want to ask you please to go over to YouTube and subscribe if you're not there. Please go over and subscribe. It helps us a lot. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, you can also subscribe, whether that's on Apple Music or whether it's on Amazon or whether it's on Spotify. My kid, my 14-year-old, is super excited that I'm on Spotify. He thinks I'm pretty cool for that one. But before we get started today, I wanted to go a little bit serious. Many of you know that we run a charity called Burgers and Vans for Suicide Prevention. And last night I received a message that a young man, 14 years old, had died by suicide. I haven't spoken to many of you since the new year because most of our shows have been recorded because I was out for surgery. But I have to tell you something that happened to me on New Year's Eve. On New Year's Eve, just let me preface this with, we are not a hotline. Our Burgers and Vans charity is not a hotline. We're not a place to call if you're in trouble. But luckily, for whatever reason, somebody did call on New Year's Eve. They got me directly. And there was a lot of luck involved in this because, first of all, I answered the phone. I didn't know who it was. I couldn't figure out on New Year's Eve who would be calling. The other bit of luck was that my husband was sitting in this room right over here and could hear me. And the call we received was from a man who was suicidal. And he was about to do something very dangerous, and it was terrifying to me because I have not been trained in how to talk someone down. And so I honestly had to be completely open and authentic and honest with this man and just do my best at trying to keep him alive, while my husband was meanwhile calling the police and trying to find his location and calling the mobile crisis unit, and we were able to get him help. But I'm telling you all of this because during this conversation, what I ended up having to say to him, because I didn't know what to say, is please don't do this because I think it might kill me as well. It might kill me. And he says, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to you whether I do this or not? You don't even know me. And I said, it matters because I care. And the truth is, I care about everybody, and you're not alone in this battle, and it will break my heart to lose you on New Year's Eve like that. So please don't do this. And I want to tell you that because the thing is, you don't know who you matter to. You have no idea. You may think you don't matter to anybody. You may have children who you have been disconnected with. You may have family who aren't talking to you, or friends who you're not talking to. You may feel completely alone, but the truth is your life matters to somebody. And on that evening, his life, and I haven't stopped thinking about him every day actually since it happened. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, talking this guy down. But I want to let you know you aren't alone in this. So I know this is a deep subject to go into while we're about to start succession planning talk, while we're about to talk about your business, but I do think it's important. And one of the other reasons I want to mention this is last night it was a 14-year-old who died by suicide. But the truth is, as entrepreneurs, we are at risk. Entrepreneurs die by suicide at a higher rate than many other businesses because we have so much stress. And especially right now, if you lose your business, you may, and it may not just be you. It may be that your employees, what happened to your employees and what happens to your family. So I want you to know you're not alone. If you need help, please do reach out and help. Whitney is probably watching this. I'm hoping that she's going to put in the comments the 1-800 number. If not, we'll find the 1-800 number. I'll put it in the comments after we're done with the show. But if you need help, please reach out. Somebody's there, or somebody can help you. You are not alone in this. All right, let's go back to housekeeping again. We are streaming live. I want to remind you that you can leave comments in the comment section, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Twitter or Facebook, and we can see those comments as I'm talking. So if you have a question for Sam today, we can actually answer them. So ask the questions. I can see them, I can tell Sam about them, and he can answer the questions. You've got experts on the show, so use us. We really do appreciate that. All right, let me introduce you to Sam Brownell. And Sam, I'm not sure I just said your name right at all. Can you make sure? Oh, hold on one second. I've muted you. Did I say it right?
You got it. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. And your company, what's the name of your company?
So Stratus Wealth Advisors. We're Stratus Wealth Advisors. We're in Kensington, Maryland, so just north of DC.
And just down the road from me now.
Correct.
I've moved to Chase, so I'm right down the road from you. And you work with businesses on what happens next, right? You work on succession planning. So to go into this, though, let's talk a little bit about, are our businesses valuable anymore? People keep talking about what's going on with businesses. And I watch, I had several clients who opened businesses during the pandemic. So how do we know what's happened to business value since the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really important because when you think about the lifestyle or the life cycle, I should say, of succession planning, the first thing that we want to do is figure out what the business is worth, because that then gives us a baseline to work everything else off of. And so what happens during something like a pandemic or any type of crisis that ends up affecting the economy is it tends not to affect each sector the same. And so think about if you were a business that was deemed essential. We do a lot of work with businesses, independent businesses in the hardware, lumber space, folks who run community pharmacies. These are businesses that, because they were essential, last year might have been a great year. In fact, for many of them, it was. Their sales were up 15, 20, 25%. So for them, it's a much different view of what the pandemic did than if you're somebody who's in the service sector, right? If you're a restaurant, right, a hospitality company, that's a totally different view. And we kind of have to look at it in two ways, right? There is what would happen if you were trying to sell your company, and then what happens long term to the value. And those are actually two different things. And it's funny, Ann, because value seems like it should be such an easy thing, right? Hey, let me throw a number on it, but it's really not. And there are lots of different values that something's worth over time. All you have to do is go and look at Apple on the stock market, right? It changes all the time. But in terms of these private businesses, last year, probably, let's say the summer, right? It was the summer I was helping a client. They were selling some of the assets of their business. That timing, things were depressed a little bit because people had no idea, right? They had no idea what was going to happen. And as difficult as it's been, and we're still not out of the woods yet, the business community has a little bit better idea of what relief options are available. And states and the federal government have done a very good job. So if you're a business owner out there and you haven't looked into some of these, I would suggest doing it, because that's the type of bridge capital that you might need to get yourself to the other side.
Well, and there's so much more than if you haven't looked into it, I would suggest really looking into it instead of waiting to find out about it, because we find out these things all the time. And I will tell my clients and they're completely shocked that it's available to them. So I would suggest really giving it a good look, call your local chambers and places like that and see, and look for those kinds of things.
Yeah. And I think the thing that folks should understand about business valuation is what we're really trying to do when we value the company is give you an idea of what an objective third party sees when they go and look at your business. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to normalize that cash flow. So every business has cash flow, right? You get your top line revenue, you take out your expenses, and there's some pre-tax profit you're making. Right? And so what we want to do is we want to see what is that pre-tax profit that somebody from the outside would be able to get if they were buying your business. And so there are adjustments that are made. And one of the things that something like a pandemic would do is we would call that an extraordinary, or what we hope is a non-recurring circumstance. And that makes a difference to your business, because if let's use this example, if I'm paying salary, right, that's something I'm going to have to pay. It's an ongoing business expense. I need to pay people to be able to perform the services and the tasks to get our work done. But let's say that I'm investing in building a new warehouse. That's not something I'm going to be doing every year. And so if I want to know what the true ongoing sustainable year after year cash flow is, I'm going to remove those non-recurring or one-time items. And so the longer we've been in this pandemic, that's how, from a valuation standpoint, we are looking at some of the effects that this has had on cash flow. Because, as I said before, if you were lucky enough to be in a sector that was deemed essential, you might have been one of the only businesses that people could go to. So your sales were going to go up, but does that mean that they're really going to go up 20% every year? Probably not. And so we want to adjust down for that. Likewise, if you've been able to operate only at 25 or 50% of capacity, that's also something that is not going to continue over a long period of time. So we need to be cognizant of the way that these affect your cash flow on a one-time basis and not a recurring basis. Because if I'm buying your business in, I care about what I can get ongoing, not what happened one of the worst years you had. That's if you're running a good business.
Let me ask you a question. And this is going to sound, clearly you work with people, and this as a wealth advisor. Is that who people will generally go to then if they're thinking about succession, is a wealth advisor? Because as you're sitting here thinking about saying this, I'm thinking about people I know who have sold their businesses or just decided to shutter in the past year without that help. And it seems to me that everybody should have a wealth advisor who can guide them on that. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so it's a really good question, because there are different folks who can help you at different parts of the journey. And what we like to do is talk about it as assembling the right team. And what we do at Stratus is we sit and we help you craft the succession plan, and then we help coordinate with those other advisors. Because if you're going to do this right, you need a good CPA, because taxes become really important. Right. You need a good lawyer. Right? You need to make sure that all your legal documents are buttoned up. And you might need a banker, right? So, if your kid or somebody internally is taking over the business, they might need to go get a loan. And so how do you work with the banker? You might need somebody in the insurance space. How do you protect your family if something were to happen to you, as we talked about earlier? And that's that happens more often than you would think, unfortunately, where either just because of old age or an accident, things happen. And so you need to have these different advisors. And what we like to think about somebody like us is we can sit in the hub of that spoke, because you're running your company. Your job is to keep running that company, make it more profitable, because that'll help increase the value. Our job is to do the coordination and help implement that succession plan, so we can quarterback that process and bring you scenarios so we can make decisions, not just throw more information at you. Because I think it can be very overwhelming, right? When your accountant says, okay, you've got to do this, and your lawyer goes, okay, you got to tie this up. And what we find is that a lot of our clients, they say, I just don't have the time for that, right? I've got 300 other things going on. And so it is very helpful to look for an exit planner. Some people label themselves wealth advisors, but people that really focus in this space, because they're going to be able to give you the guidance that you need. And it may seem like a big, I've got to make an investment. I'm going to work with this person over 2, 3, 4 years. But think of it like any investment, right? There's going to be a return on that. If you're spending X, you may get 5 or 10X back from it in your sale value. So we do think that it's worth it, and do look for those labels: succession planner, exit planner, wealth planners. Those are really important to make sure you tie together all the loose ends.
Okay, that's good to know. That's real, and I just had never really thought about it. So let's talk about, we talked a little bit about why succession planning is important. What happens if something happens to you? What are some of the other, what are some of your other thoughts about why it's important to start this now? And how early do you start it?
Yeah. I mean, those are both excellent questions. And, we would say that really important to do 3 to 5 years, because one of the first things is when you're selling a business, regardless of whether you're selling it internally to a key employer or a family member or externally to a strategic or financial buyer, is when they come in, when these folks come in and they want to see, or the bank is going to try to give you a loan, they're going to want to see 3 years of historical financials and or tax returns.
Okay.
And so if you can really clean those up, a lot of us, I own my own business too. And a lot of us, we do things like we may loan the company money. Okay?
Right.
We want to get those things off the books. We don't want somebody, a third party, asking questions about, well, is this business really sustainable, or is it just a lifestyle business that this person keeps afloat because they have cash flow other places?
Right.
And so those are questions that we want to answer. And one of the things that we always talk to folks about why we do that business valuation first is we want to be that potential buyer. So we ask the hard questions up front so that we can start fixing them, because your business is, in a lot of ways, it's like a barge. It takes a while to turn that ship. And so we want to make sure that it's turning enough so that people aren't just like, oh, okay, well, she just did a whole bunch of window dressing the last year just to make things look really good before she sold the company. Buyers are smart. They're going to have their own team and they're going to look through that stuff. So it's important to clean up those financials, because we all have things that we'll take care of it next year, and that's fine.
Right.
But as you're getting ready for that transition, it is important. So at least 3 years, we would say, gives you the opportunity to really get the business in shape, because the other analogy is it's like selling a house, right? If you don't put a fresh coat of paint on, if you don't have it clean, it's going to affect the ultimate sales price.
Right. Well, and so now that's leading me back to the one of the questions, which is, is there any time that's too early? So if somebody had told me when I first started this business, you should have a plan, an exit plan. And I'm like, well, I'll just stop doing it. But then I started hiring people. And when you start hiring people, you go, well, I can't just stop doing it, because then they lose their jobs. Right. So is it too early to start before, as you start, should you start with an exit plan?
Yeah. And I would say you don't need to start with an exit plan. One of the things to keep in mind about your business is that for many folks, that business will be the most valuable asset they have in their portfolio, whether they think about it as an asset or not. And keep that in mind. One of the things that we really like to tell folks is run the business with the eventual sale in mind. So you don't necessarily have to have the plan in place 20 years ahead of time. Of course, you could.
Right.
But things may change. But think of the business like an asset, because one of the things, once we get that business value, one of the important pieces of succession planning is we then sit down with the owner and we go through what's called a retirement cash flow analysis. And we say, okay, what are you getting from the business? What's the cash flow that you're getting? How is it funding your current spending? And then what are the items in the future that we can rely on? Things like Social Security, maybe you've got an annuity, maybe you've got rental property, those types of things. And then there's going to be a gap between what you're currently paying yourself, what you may be getting in income in the future, and then that business value plus your other assets, bank accounts, retirement accounts, any other life insurance, stuff like that. That's going to have to fill that income gap over your retirement lifespan. And as people are living longer, this analysis becomes really important, because one thing that as business owners we often don't think about is diversifying our wealth outside of our business, because we're so focused on reinvesting
The business, right?
in the business, which is great. But we also encourage folks to start thinking, make sure you've got those retirement plans in place and give to them. It's a tax break for the business. It's great benefit, right? It can help attract talent, and all those things really, really matter to you down the road. So yeah, that's a big, important piece of the succession planning. Is at some point, I don't think I've met a business owner yet who, when it comes right to it, they want to die with their boots on, right? They'd like to do something post business.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a lot of folks don't feel like they have that opportunity.
Right. Well, and if you don't plan for, I mean, quite honestly, when you go back to the simple, why is it important? I guess about 5 years ago, a local mechanic where I used to live passed away, and his family lost everything because there was no real plan for what to do after, right? And there was nobody really running the business other than him, and there was no plan for him, and that, watching that scared me. It scared me, what happens then, So,
No, you're spot on. And those types of what we call trigger events become really important. And it doesn't just have to be death. I mean, it could be, you could be in a partnership and there could be your partner could get divorced. There could be a personal bankruptcy. All these things need to be thought through ahead of time during the so-called peacetime, so that when there is a crisis, you're not trying to deal with the crisis and also try to figure out what is the right protocol for the business.
Right, absolutely. So, this kind of leads into, what are your options? So what are some of the ownership transfer options?
Yeah. And so you have to think about it in two different ways, and that's internal or external. And so when we first sit down with a business owner, one of the questions we ask is, have you started to think about who might be the next generation of ownership? And sometimes it will be, yes, I'd really, my son or my daughter or both of them have been working in the business for 10 or 15 years. I'd really like to bring them on board. That's a great option. Sometimes it'll be key employees that have been, you've had a great manager for 20 years, and they're like family at this point, right? They might come over to Thanksgiving dinner, and they're really interested in taking over the business. And so those are a little bit different in that generally the transfer price is going to be a little bit lower, right? The sales price is going to be a little bit lower, because in that situation, you want to make sure that the business survives going forward. And so with internal transfers, it's really important for us to sit down, and we were just doing this last month for a client, cash flow projections, because whoever is taking over that business internally is not only going to have to be able to fund the ongoing operations, but generally they're going to have to fund the buyout. They're going to have to buy out the outgoing owner. And so we have to make sure that there's cash flow in the business to support that. Otherwise, we have to start thinking about some different options, such as going to the bank and getting a loan. So those are your sort of more traditional internal. There's another internal option that's gaining more popularity now, especially as lots of owners, because a lot of the owners we work with are in more rural communities, in smaller communities. They may run a lumber yard in southwestern Ohio, and they are the biggest employer, or one of the biggest employers in town. But lots of times their kids, they went to college in New York City, and they're not really interested in coming home and running the family business. And so in this case, there's what's called an ESOP, right? An employee stock ownership plan. Okay. And that's where you can actually sell the company, and then all of the employees can get an ownership stake. It's generally based on their age and salary level, time in the company. But those can be useful options to create a market, so to speak, for owners who are exiting the business and can't find an internal buyer, but don't necessarily want to sell it to a competitor. So that's the internal. And then the external side is generally what you're looking at is a strategic buyer, right? So somebody who's a competitor of yours looking to expand into your area. And generally, these folks are going to be able to pay more than an internal transfer because they've already got a lot of the infrastructure in place, right? They may have an HR team, so they don't need to double up on those expenses. They may already have a delivery fleet. Let's say if they're in a business like lumber or hardware, they may already have physical store space, and so they're not going to need as many of your assets. And so that means that the cash flow to them is worth more because there aren't as many expenses knocking it down. And so they may be willing to pay more. And so that's always something we encourage folks is talk to your local chambers of commerce. A lot of people we work with are part of bigger buying groups, purchasing co-ops, buying groups. Going to these people and talking to them about who's interested, because in any market, there are going to be folks looking to expand. And if you can find the right strategic buyer, that can be a really good option. And these groups or your local chamber of commerce, trade associations, they're oftentimes have a finger on the pulse of who might be interested at that time in buying your business. And you may be surprised. There may be more people out there than you think.
Right. I think a lot of us think, well, who's going to want to buy my business? I run my business, so who's going to want to do that? But I think that there are options out there, and it's good to hear that there really are. So I do want to talk about something that none of us like, which is taxes. So what are the tax implications here? What should we be thinking about here?
Yeah, so that's a really great question because, and this is whenever we give a talk about the tax mitigation strategies, the one thing we tell folks is it's the net, not the gross sales price, right? If I say, hey, Ann, I'm going to buy your business. Here's a check for $5 million. We know right off the top that $5 million is not going into your bank account because once we account for, okay, is it taxed at capital gains? What part is ordinary income? What are state and local taxes? You could be paying 40, 50% of that back to the government. And so the idea here is, and we like to think of it in 3 steps, right? There's what you can do pre-sale, there's the actual structure of the sale, and then there's the post-sale earnout or buyout, because all of those become really, really important. And so generally pre-sale, there's generally more you can do if it's an internal buyer, just because your options are greater, right? Let's say that I'm going to buy your business and we're family. We may be able to say, okay, well, Ann only needs 70% of the overall price to fund her retirement goals. So maybe over the next 3 years, you're going to gift me 10% of the business a year. Okay. And so that'll do 2 things. Number one, it'll start moving that bigger asset out of your estate. So if something were to happen to you, all of a sudden that business isn't taxed 100% to your estate. It then starts giving me more responsibility. And lots of times the next generation in the family can feel very motivated as they start to gain some traction in actual ownership. And lots of times we hear kids say to us, wow, I never thought my parents would ever let go. And the gifting strategy can be a good way because it's both from a tax standpoint, you're starting to get money out of the parents' estate. The ownership is transferring without anybody having to write a check. So there's no tax implications there. And unless you have a huge company with a huge estate, right? Until the end of 2025, unless tax law changes, for married couples, that lifetime exemption is over $22 million. That's high. And most of the business owners we work with, those businesses are not worth more than $22 million. So it can be a very good way to make that transfer in a tax efficient. And then at the end of that period, let's say the 3-year period, then the actual buyout will happen. And at that point, either I will go to the bank and get a loan to pay you, or what happens a lot of times in these internal transfers is what's called seller financing. Essentially, we'll have a lawyer set up what's called a promissory note, which will say Sam is going to pay back Ann over 10 years at X percent, 2.5% a year. And that can be a really good way too, because instead of me just cutting you a check let's say the price is $1 million, just so that I can do the math easy in my head.
Right.
You need 700,000. Instead of me giving you a check for 700,000, maybe I'm paying you $70,000 a year over 10 years. And because now your income is lower, we've reduced the taxes that you're going to have to pay on that buyout. So really important pre-sale to think about, where are the tax brackets for all the parties involved in an internal sale? And do you do gifting? Sometimes it might make sense to increase the key employee or the child's salary by $5,000 or $10,000 a month, and then they can start buying business a little bit at a time. Especially if you've got an owner that's in the top tax bracket, and you've got a child or a key employee who's maybe in the 24% tax bracket. There's a lot of room to work.
That's great. And it's as you're saying this, it's occurring to me. You may not know the story. I jumped into this business. I literally started it. I tell people by accident, right? So it occurs to me that getting out of this business eventually will take a lot longer than it took me to get into it, which was I got a business card and I started a website.
Right.
Right. But it is good. I mean, and I'm a firm believer in jumping in with both feet, but in selling your business, you've convinced me that really you have to slow down and you have to think about it and you have to plan for it in advance, a lot in advance. You said 3 to 5 years at least.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And it's not that you can't do it, right? If you would come, you come and you say, hey, I just want to be out at the end of 2021. There are things you can do it's not as impactful. And the planning, it does take time, like you said, because the business is a big asset. And for most folks we work with, it is the biggest asset that they have, whether or not they're actually thinking of it as an asset. And so it's important to have good stewardship of that asset. And so you think about it before, and then there's actually the way that the business is sold. Are you going to sell the entire legal entity? Right. Or are you just going to sell the assets of the business? And we were working with a client last summer, and we sold just the assets of the business. They kept the LLC, and then they were able to go and run some consulting that they did. It was a structure, and this is, again, gets to the post sale. Right. Is lots of times what you can do post sale, even if it's an external buyer, is you can set up some type of consulting or non-compete. And hey, Ian, if I buy your business, we're going to sign a non-compete, and I'm going to pay you over the next 5 years not to start a competitor or to go work at a competitor. And that can be a great way to again mitigate the tax, stretch out the payments over a number of years, while creating a win. Because ultimately, and I think this gets back to what you had mentioned up top, is about the employees, is most business owners we work with care deeply about their employees and the communities that they work in. And so what we want to do is, every time we sit down and we craft a succession plan and we help the owner walk through it, it's got to be a win for three parties: the outgoing owner, the incoming owner, and then those loyal employees and customers, because all those people they can all win if you do this right.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's so important to most people. I mean, maybe there are people, and you've seen people who say, "That's fine, I'm going to sell it if they run it into the ground." It's what they do. Right. We've seen it, but most people care a whole lot about it. So let's go back and let's talk about protecting your family during succession. Why is this important, and how do you do it? Yeah. So this is probably a good place to talk about a couple stories, right? Beware. It's always good to keep stuff in mind. And a lot of times what happens is, when you start a transition, if you're the sole owner of your business and you decide that the way you want to do this is bring on a younger partner, let's say you're going to give them 5 or 10% of the business. Doesn't sound like a lot, but as soon as you get any type of other owner, you're going to want to put in place what's called a buy-sell agreement, which essentially is going to run through, if something were to happen to one of the owners,
What steps are we going to follow? How will their shares be valued? What buyout options are there? Does the company have right of first refusal? Or, and this will lead into a story. I was working with folks in the ran an independent grocer, and they had with their CPA set up what was a very good strategy of, as we talked about before, gifting. They were going to do 4 years of gifts to their daughter, and then the daughter was going to buy out the business. Daughter was, as the plan started, the daughter got married. And that's a trigger event. That's a trigger event that needed to be updated in their planning documents, and it wasn't. And so what happened is when they hit the 4th year, when the daughter was going to buy out the rest of the 60% of the company, she and her husband got divorced. Now, he was working in the company too, but nothing said in the legal documents. They didn't put a buy-sell in place.
Right.
And so nothing said that the company is going to stay internal to the family. And so the husband's family turned around and sued and ended up getting a minority stake in the business. And so I was called in by the family to see if we could work out a strategy to eventually buy the husband out. And we were able to do it. It took time and effort, and it took money because they had to bring me in, they had to bring in lawyers, and all could have been avoided if they had just set up the right legal documents at the right time as soon as they started gifting shares to their daughter. If I'm going to buy 5% of your business tomorrow, and the first thing we need to do, besides make sure that my check clears, is put together a buy-sell agreement so that if something were to happen to one of us, we would know exactly what to do. And that also gets to, as you said, protecting your family, because I'll give you another example of folks we work with. And there were 2 partners, lived in a mid-sized city. They had run a business for years and years together. Mm-hmm. They had been 50% partners, which we generally don't like people to do, but they had gotten along really well. They made a lot of great decisions. 20 years, this was probably 5 years ago. So back around 1995, they had taken out life insurance policies on each other, which can be a very good strategy in a business partnership, right? Because if you and I are partners, we each take out $500,000. That can be really useful, because if something were to happen to one of us, we can write into that buy-sell, which says that the first thing that happens if Sam dies is that life insurance will go to you. You can use that as a down payment on my family, and then you'll be able to pay out the family, go to the bank and get a loan and pay them out over the next 5 years or 7 years or whatever the documents stipulate. And so in this case with these 2 folks, there were 2 issues. Number one was they never updated the life insurance policies. And so when we came in and valued the business was $6 million, meaning that their $500,000 policies were great, but that was just a down payment towards the $3 million that their stake of the business was actually owned. And so then what we did is we went and we talked about updating that life insurance. We talked about putting in place a clause which essentially said, if one of you dies, the other one can go to the bank. They can use that life insurance as collateral to take out a loan, which then pay back the other side over 7 years it ended up being. And sure enough, a few years later, one of the owners did die. They were in their 70s, and we were able to execute this plan, because the last thing you want to do when folks are grieving is have to go to them and say, you need to make a really tough decision here. So it is important. And it's important that, like you said earlier, you don't leave the family of your business partners high and dry with nothing to show for the years of work in the business.
Right. Absolutely. It's really amazing to me. When we started this conversation, I just didn't know how in depth it was, or how much you really needed to know. So it is, succession planning is something that you really should not be even thinking about doing on your own. It's going to take a team.
Yeah, and it can be, and what we like to tell folks is really assemble that team early, because yes, it's going to be an outlay of money, but it will come back as a return on investment, because if we put in place the right plan to maximize your business value, the right plan to mitigate taxes, the right plan to protect your family, you may end up investing, let's say, $15,000 or $20,000 in the succession planning process, and your business may end up selling for $100,000 or $200,000 more. And that to us that's the stories that we like to see. Those are the folks we like to work with, because it does take commitment. I mean, let's face it, this is not okay, I'd like to be out by the end of February.
Right.
Right. And you can do it, but you're probably not going to set yourself up in the right way. And I guess the last thing in terms of protecting your family to really think about is, and one of the first things we do is, if folks have a partnership, even if they have a buy-sell agreement, we want to read through it, because lots of times people will have in their death or disability, but it's these other things like divorce or personal bankruptcy that also need to be included in these documents, because unfortunately these things, they happen, and they have a way,
yeah.
and they happen at really inconvenient times. Let's just be honest.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I'm not sure how often there are. It's a convenient time for any of those, right? So,
Yes, it's a good point. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, so let's go. We're about actually out of. Sorry, we're about out of time, but I want to talk about. I usually end the show with, what are your favorite books? Like, if you had to say to somebody about their business, or even if it's not, it doesn't have to be about business. Your favorite book that you think people really should read.
Yeah. So I'm a big history buff.
Uh-huh.
I read a lot of nonfiction. I would say that some of my favorites, one of my favorite authors is Doris Kearns Goodwin, and if you're somebody that really likes U.S. history, A Team of Rivals is a fascinating
Oh,
book.
I love that book. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that, in my opinion, those types of books have a lot to say to us as entrepreneurs, because you look at somebody like Abraham Lincoln, talk about coming into a totally crazy situation, having to improvise on the fly, or somebody
Right.
like FDR, who she just wrote that new book about leadership in times of crisis. And
Right.
you come in the middle of a Great Depression, you're coming in as the administration changeover in the middle of a pandemic, and you have to be entrepreneurial. You have no choice but to really start moving forward, jump in with both feet, as you said. And if something
Absolutely.
sticks, great. And if not, you have to be willing to move on and try something else. So those are books that I really like, because I think they have a lot to say about what we do in the independent business community every day, trying to make sure that our business is surviving and our customers are getting what they need, and we're able to support our family and our employees. So those are books that I go back to time and again, just to remind myself that we can do this.
And it's so true. So actually, you're saying that you said Team of Rivals, which it's a book I loved. I was just talking to somebody this morning, because they say, "Oh, I read nothing but business books," and they were naming off, One by Daniel Pink, and Atomic Habits, and this whole, and they're all great. They're great books. The ones that usually hit me hardest, are the ones that really, like, I learn most from, are biographies, or history. But right now I'm reading Andre Agassi's book,
Sure.
and Open, and it's what does tennis have to do with it? Well, there's a lot. There's a lot
Yeah.
as you're reading it, that you're like, is this something that I'm doing as a business owner? Is this something that I can implement? Is this something I can do? So and my husband's reading the Mattis book right now, and the same thing. He's saying saying these things to me that are making me think. He was talking about last night a scene where Mattis is in a room with surrounded basically by 40 enemies with guns, and I'm thinking, well, what does this have to do with my business? But the more you think about it, it's like, there are times where you think, that's where I'm sitting.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That's
Right.
what this feels like.
Yeah.
So yeah, so books are interesting, what you can get from them. All right, let's tell people how they can find you. So the website is stratuswealthadvisors.com. And then you're also on LinkedIn.
Yes.
So
Yeah. So feel free to reach out at LinkedIn. Stratus Wealth Advisors, we've got a lot of great resources. One of the things that we really try to provide is education, because this is a very specific niche, the succession planning, and most, I would say 95% of our clients will only do this once.
Right.
And so it's really important that you get it right, and it's also really important that you know what you're getting into. And so there are a lot of resources. Ian and I were just talking before we came on. There's a succession planning kit on our website.
I actually just pulled that up because
Perfect.
Whitney just put it up. So it's in the comments on Facebook in particular if you want to find it, but we'll also have it in the show notes after the show. So you talk a little bit about what it is exactly so people know what they're beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of a lessons learned over the years of working with independent business owners and their families and their companies, and giving you an idea of what we've learned over the years and what steps you really need to take as you move forward. What are those steps you need to take to make sure that you got your business continuity in place? Right. Do you have the cash flow to make it 6 months, as we talked about earlier? Doing these scenario projections can let you go to your advisors and think, yeah, maybe I do need to think about some of these government resources. I wonder what's out there, because it's a lot easier to tap, whether it's a government resource, whether it's a line of credit at a bank. It's a lot easier to do it before you're running out of money. And right. So doing some of these things ahead of time, we've learned really, really important. What documents you're going to need for evaluation. What does that look like? What you're basically opening your books up to that valuator so that they can really get in there. And so it can be a little uncomfortable at first. So it's good to know. It's good to know what you're getting into. And then things like, we have a checklist for buy-sell agreements. What are the questions you need to be asking if you're bringing on a partner? Or if you already have partners and go, buy-sell agreement, what's that? Right. That's perfectly fine too. So education is that's a huge part of what we do. And that's why, Ann, thank you very much for having me, because it is really important, because we want to make sure that the businesses that these independents are creating is something that they're not only proud of, but something that is going to be a financial foundation for their life.
Right. Well, and what you said is right. It is funny. I own this business, and I've got employees, I've got an office, but I never think of it as an asset. It's not something that I think of as an asset. And even in my family, my husband's great about it, but I will often think of it in a different way. Like this is just something I do that's on the side, and he has to constantly say to me, this is valuable to our family. He has to remind me of this. So yeah, it is important. All right. It was really great having you on, and that sounds great. Please do go over to Stratus Wealth Advisors, look into Insights Business Planning Kit. That's a really good place to start. And then Sam, they can reach out to you if they need help. And then if they want other places as well, they can reach out. I also want to put this up because it did just come up on our show. So 1-800-273-8255. That is the suicide prevention hotline. It really is a great place to go if you are in need. There's also pretty much any county you're in, there is something called the Mobile Crisis Unit or Crisis Response Team, and that is usually a warm line. It's not saying, hey, I'm suicidal right now, but I am really struggling. I'm struggling and I just need help. So there are ways for you to get help. Please do that. And then I want to remind everybody else, please do subscribe and leave us a review. If you have time to go over to specifically Apple, if you go to Apple Music and leave us a review, makes a big difference. We're a small business running this podcast. We don't actually make money off the podcast. We're not monetizing it in any way. But the more reviews we get, the better chance that eventually might be able to monetize this and help my small business as well. So please do that. Sam, I cannot thank you enough. This is it was nice to have you as my first guest. Everybody out there who's been listening to this may think this is not my first guest of the year, but for me, it's my first guest I've spoken to since the new year started, because I've been out of work for the past month with my surgery. So it's nice to have you to come back to.
Yeah, no, thank you again for having me, and this has been great, and look forward to helping folks any way I can.
That's great. And you stick around just 1 minute. Everybody else, I will see you on, actually, I may see you Wednesday on YouTube, and I'll see you Monday everywhere else. Bye-bye.